My name is Margaret Ellison, and I never thought I'd hear those words come out of my daughter-in-law's mouth. Go live in a shelter, she said casually, as if I were a stray cat lingering on her doorstep, an unwanted burden to be cast aside. The words sliced through me like glass. For a moment, I just stood there frozen, trying to understand if I had heard her correctly. My son sat silently on the couch, staring at his phone, deliberately avoiding my eyes. He didn't defend me. He didn't even flinch. I felt my chest tighten, not from anger, but from a deep, hollow ache. After all I had given, after every sacrifice I had made for them, this was what I was worth to them: nothing. I have always been a quiet woman, the kind of person who believes dignity is found in restraint. My late husband Henry used to say I had the patience of a saint, though he also knew that when I finally reached my breaking point, I was not a woman to underestimate. People assumed that my silence meant weakness, but Henry understood better. That day, though, my silence wasn't strength, it was disbelief. I simply nodded, excused myself, and stepped outside. The air was cold, biting at my cheeks, but I welcomed it. It was better than the suffocating tension in that house. I stood on their porch for a long moment, staring at the home I had silently helped them build. The brick walls, the landscaped lawn, the shiny new windows, all of it was familiar because I had paid for it. Every last brick, every last shingle, every last nail. It was my money that had secured this roof over their heads, and yet they had never known. I had always insisted on anonymity, letting my son take the credit. I wanted him to feel proud to believe he had provided this life for his family. I thought I was protecting his dignity as a man, as a husband, as a father. I never wanted him to feel indebted to me. But as I stood there replaying her words in my head, something shifted inside me. For decades, I had been the one who carried everyone else. When my husband died, I sold our construction business, split the proceeds with my son, and tucked the rest away for emergencies. I had never lived extravagantly. My home was modest, my clothes simple, my needs few. Every dollar I spent on them was given out of love, not obligation. And yet that love had been met with disdain. I remembered every holiday where I had been quietly overlooked, every family dinner where my presence seemed like an inconvenience. My daughter-in-law's smiles were polite, but empty. Her words laced with subtle jabs, compliments that were really insults, the kind that made you feel small without being able to protest. But this wasn't subtle. It was a declaration, a warning that in her eyes I had overstayed my welcome. As I walked to my car, I felt something inside me harden. I had spent years believing silence was my greatest strength, but maybe silence had allowed them to forget who I was. Maybe silence had made me invisible. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel, staring blankly ahead. Then slowly a thought crept in, cold and calculated. They had no idea. They had no idea that the deed to this house still bore my name. They had no idea that the mortgage they bragged about paying off had in fact been paid in full by me years ago. They had no idea just how much power I still held over everything they thought was theirs. Memories flooded back: the day I signed the final check, the relief on my son's face when I told him he no longer had to worry about debt. The way my daughter-in-law had cried tears of gratitude, hugging him and saying he was the best provider. She never once thanked me, never even asked how they had managed such a miracle. I had stayed quiet because I believed love didn't need credit. But as I sat in that car watching the sun dip behind their perfect suburban house, I realized something profound. Silence might be noble, but it was also the reason they felt entitled to dismiss me. For the first time in years, I smiled, a small, quiet smile that held no joy, only resolve. If she wanted me to go live in a shelter, perhaps it was time to remind her whose shelter she had been living under all along. The weight of that realization settled on my chest, not like a burden, but like armor. For years I had given freely, expecting nothing in return. But I was done being invisible. They thought they knew me. They thought I was powerless. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet park a few blocks away and just sat there staring at the empty playground swings swaying in the wind. The cold breeze carried the faint sound of children laughing in the distance, a sound that used to bring me joy when my son was little. Now it only reminded me of what I had lost, of how far we had drifted from the family I once believed we were. As I sat there, memories came flooding back. I thought about Henry, my late husband. We had built our lives from scratch, two kids from working-class families who believed that hard work and kindness would always be rewarded. Henry was the heart of our small construction company, and I was the quiet force behind the scenes, managing the books, the payroll, the paperwork that kept everything running. We weren't rich, but we were stable. We gave our son a life far better than either of us had growing up. When Henry died unexpectedly, everything fell on my shoulders. My son was still finding his footing in his own career. I didn't want him to drown in debt trying to support his new wife and their baby on a single income. So when the time came to buy a house, I quietly stepped in. I paid off the mortgage without saying a word. I told my son it was an anonymous gift, someone who wanted to see him succeed. He never asked questions, never wondered why his mother's bank account seemed to shrink overnight. He took the credit, beaming with pride as his wife gushed over what a provider he was. At the time, I felt nothing but happiness watching him glow with confidence. But looking back now, I realized how that one decision shaped everything that followed. My silence became their ignorance. My generosity became their entitlement. I could still remember the day they moved in. My daughter-in-law Laura had tears in her eyes as she walked through the empty rooms, already envisioning where she would put the new furniture, the curtains, the nursery. She hugged my son and whispered, "I always knew you'd give me the life I deserve." She never looked at me, never thanked me. That was the first time I noticed the gap forming between us. Over the years, Laura grew more confident, more assertive. She started making decisions for the family as though my son were merely a bystander. Holiday plans changed, family traditions disappeared, and slowly I became less of a grandmother and more of a guest. At first, I brushed it off. "She's young," I told myself. "She'll settle down." But the subtle comments started adding up, remarks about my old-fashioned ideas, jokes about how I must be lonely living by myself. Little digs that stung but were easy to ignore if I pretended not to notice. The final blow came that morning when she told me to go live in a shelter. For years, I had swallowed my pride, convincing myself that keeping peace was more important than being acknowledged. But as I sat in that car, I realized something I should have understood long ago. People who take advantage of kindness only grow bolder when you never draw a line. And now it was time to draw one. I took a deep breath and pulled out my old leather handbag, rummaging until I found a small key one that opened the fireproof box in my closet. Inside that box were every receipt, every deed, every document tied to that house. I had never thrown them away. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew this much. I wasn't going to remain silent anymore. As I drove home, I thought about what Henry would say if he were still here. He had always believed in fairness. He would have told me, "Margaret, you have a right to demand respect. You don't owe anyone an explanation for that." For the first time in years, I believed him. That night, as I sat in my living room, surrounded by papers that told the story of every sacrifice I had ever made, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Power. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about reclaiming the piece of myself I had given away too freely. I neatly stacked the documents and placed them in a folder. Tomorrow I would make an appointment with my lawyer. Laura had no idea what was coming. And that, I thought, with a quiet, bitter smile, was exactly how I wanted it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the neat stack of papers in front of me. The mortgage statements, the final payment confirmation, the property deed, with my name on it. These documents were more than just paper. They were proof of a lifetime of sacrifices that had gone unseen. Each receipt carried a memory. The day Henry and I decided to sell the company, the nights I stayed up late balancing books to make sure we could keep every employee paid, the moment I transferred thousands of dollars without hesitation because my son needed it more than I did. I touched the deed gently, my fingers lingering on the embossed seal. It struck me how much power I had given away simply by staying silent. It wasn't that I expected gratitude true, giving never does, but I had allowed my silence to erase me. After finishing my tea, I dressed carefully, choosing a dark blue coat Henry had always loved. It gave me confidence, made me feel like I was stepping into the world with purpose. Before leaving, I slipped the folder of documents into my bag. Driving to the lawyer's office, I rehearsed in my mind what I would say. I hadn't seen Mr. Walters, our family lawyer, in years, but he had always been kind to me, patient even when Henry's temper flared during business negotiations. When I walked into his office, he looked up from his desk, surprised but pleased to see me. "Margaret," he said warmly, "it's been too long. What brings you here today?" I took a deep breath and placed the folder on his desk. "I need to discuss my property rights," I said quietly but firmly. He opened the folder, scanning the papers. His brows lifted slightly as he flipped through each document. "Margaret, this house is still legally yours," he said. "You paid off the mortgage entirely. Unless you signed over the deed, and from what I can see, you didn't. You are the rightful owner." Hearing those words out loud filled me with a strange mix of relief and regret. Relief that I still had a voice in this matter. Regret that I had waited so long to use it. Mr. Walters leaned forward. "What do you want to do?" I hesitated for a moment, then met his eyes. "I want to make sure they understand that I'm not powerless. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I can't let them treat me this way anymore." He nodded. "There are ways to handle this discreetly. You can assert ownership without making it messy. But Margaret, you need to be prepared. Your son and daughter-in-law won't take this lightly." I smiled faintly. I'm done being the woman who stays quiet to keep the peace. Before leaving, I signed the papers that would solidify my legal control. It felt strange, empowering, and terrifying at the same time. On my way home, I stopped at the grocery store. As I walked the aisles, I found myself thinking about Laura, how confidently she had told me to go live in a shelter. Did she really see me as such a burden? Or had she just grown so comfortable with my quiet giving that she forgot I was a person with boundaries? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Laura had always viewed my generosity as weakness. She had mistaken kindness for servitude. That evening, I called my son. His voice was tense, as if he already knew why I was calling. "Hi, Mom," he said flat. "I'd like you and Laura to come over tomorrow evening," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. "There are some things we need to discuss. Important things." There was a pause. "Is this about what Laura said yesterday?" he asked, sounding more annoyed than apologetic. "It's about everything," I replied simply. After hanging up, I stared out the window at the darkening sky. The quiet street outside seemed unchanged, but inside me everything felt different. For years I had been the backbone of this family, invisible but essential. Tomorrow they would finally see me not as a burden, not as a fragile old woman, but as the person who had given them everything. And they would learn exactly what it meant to underestimate me. The next day felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself was waiting for what was about to unfold. I spent the morning cleaning my house, not because anyone was coming over my son, and Laura would be meeting me at their place, but because I needed to keep my hands busy. The act of scrubbing the kitchen counter, folding laundry, and watering my plants calmed me, reminded me that I still had control over some things, even if my family had forgotten that. By the afternoon, my resolve was steady. I reviewed the folder of documents one last time. Each paper carried years of silent sacrifice. Bank transfers, receipts, and finally the stamped mortgage payoff letter that bore my name. Looking at it filled me with a sense of bittersweet pride. I had once thought these papers represented love, proof that I had done everything to give my son a better life. Now they felt like evidence of how far I had let myself disappear. As evening approached, I drove to their house. The sky was streaked with gold and pink, a strangely beautiful backdrop for what I knew could be the ugliest conversation we had ever had. When I rang the doorbell, Laura answered. Her expression was tight, her smile forced. "Margaret," she said curtly. "Come in." My son sat on the couch, his eyes darting between us. "Mom," he said, attempting a neutral tone. "What's going on?" I didn't sit down. Instead, I placed the folder on the coffee table. I wanted to talk about the house, I said simply. Laura raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. What about it? I think it's time you both understood where it really came from, I replied. I opened the folder and laid out the documents one by one. The mortgage statements, the payoff letter, the deed with my name on it. At first, neither of them spoke. Laura's smugness faltered as she scanned the papers, her eyes widening slightly. My son stared silent, his face flushing with embarrassment. You paid for this? Laura finally asked, her voice shaky. Yes, I said calmly. Every brick, every nail, every cent. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. I wanted you to have pride in your home. But after yesterday, I realized my silence has only made you forget who helped you stand where you are. Laura crossed her arms. Why are you telling us this now? I met her gaze steadily. Because I'm tired of being treated like a burden in a house that I paid for. Yesterday's words were cruel, Laura, and I won't allow them to stand. My son finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom, why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want you to feel ashamed, I replied. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see that staying quiet has only erased me from my own story. The room felt heavy with silence. Laura's face hardened, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes, a recognition that the power dynamic had shifted. I gathered the papers back into the folder and stood up. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to remind you both that respect is not optional. I own this house, and whether I continue to let you live here will depend on how you treat me moving forward. Laura opened her mouth, ready to fire back, but my son raised his hand, stopping her. Laura, just stop. For the first time in years, he looked at me with something close to guilt. Mom, I didn't know. I'm sorry. I nodded but said nothing more. I turned and walked out, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. As I stepped outside into the crisp night air, I felt strangely lighter. I didn't need to shout or argue. The truth had been enough. And now I thought the real reckoning would begin. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My body felt heavy with exhaustion, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying what had happened. The look on Laura's face, the mixture of shock and anger, was burned into my memory. My son's shame was even harder to bear. I had expected Laura to lash out to defend herself. Instead, she had been quiet, clearly calculating her next move. That silence told me more than any words could. She wasn't remorseful. She was just blindsided. The next morning, I woke up to a text message from my son. Mom, Laura wants to talk. Can you come over tonight? I stared at the screen, my heart tightening. For a brief moment, I wanted to say yes, to believe that maybe this was the start of reconciliation. But deep down, I knew Laura too well. She didn't want to apologize. She wanted to regain control. Instead of replying, I went about my morning. I made myself a simple breakfast toast with jam and tea, and then sat at my kitchen table staring at the envelope of documents. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my silence yesterday had been too generous. I had told them the truth, yes, but I hadn't acted on it. And Laura was the kind of person who needed consequences to understand. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Walters, my lawyer. I've decided, I told him. I want the deed transferred solely to my name. I don't want any ambiguity about who owns that house. He was quiet for a moment, then said, Are you sure? This will make things very clear and very final. I'm sure, I replied. The process wasn't complicated. I already had legal ownership. All it took was finalizing paperwork that ensured my son and Laura had no legal claim without my permission. As I signed the forms later that afternoon, I felt a strange calm wash over me. That evening, I finally replied to my son's message. I won't be coming over. We've said enough for now. When you're ready to talk with respect, you can come to me. He didn't respond. For the next few days, I heard nothing. No calls, no texts. Part of me hurt he was still my son, and no matter what he'd done, I loved him. But another part of me felt strangely liberated. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for their approval or validation. 3 days later, Laura showed up at my door. She stood there, her arms crossed, her eyes cold. We need to talk, she said. I stepped aside and let her in, saying nothing. She sat at my kitchen table, glancing around my modest home as if she couldn't believe I lived so simply. Look, she began, her tone clipped. I don't know what you're trying to prove, but you can't just dangle this over our heads. We have children. This is their home. I met her gaze calmly. You're right. It is their home. Which is why I suggest you start treating the person who gave it to you with some respect. Laura scoffed. So what now? You're going to throw us out. Leave your grandchildren without a house. I leaned forward slightly. No, Laura, I'm not throwing anyone out. But I'm done being treated like I don't matter. If you want me gone, that's fine. But understand this, you've been living in my house. Every meal you've eaten, every holiday, you've celebrated every memory you've made there, it all happened because of me. For once, Laura didn't have a comeback. She left soon after, her jaw tight, her pride clearly wounded. As I closed the door, I realized that the real power wasn't in owning the house. It was in finally refusing to be erased from my own life. And that power I promised myself I would never give up again. Days passed in tense silence. My phone stayed stubbornly quiet except for the occasional message from my grandchildren. Simple things like, "Hi, Grandma, I miss you." Those texts warmed my heart, reminding me why I had sacrificed so much in the first place. They were innocent. They had no idea about the undercurrents swirling between their parents and me. But Laura's absence was telling. She wasn't used to losing control, and I knew she was planning her next move. That was fine. I was planning mine too. One morning, as I was sipping tea by the window, a knock came at the door. To my surprise, it was my son alone. His face looked drawn, his shoulders slumped, like a man carrying the weight of two worlds. "Mom," he said softly, "can I come in?" I nodded and stepped aside. He sat at the kitchen table staring at his hands. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I didn't know you paid for everything. I just thought, well, I guess I didn't think at all." "You didn't want to know," I replied gently but firmly. "It was easier to believe you had done it all yourself." He winced at my words, but didn't deny them. "Laura, she's angry. She says you're trying to humiliate us." I tilted my head. "Do you think that's what I'm doing?" He looked down. "No, I think you're finally standing up for yourself. And maybe that's what scares us." His honesty startled me. For a moment, I saw my little boy again, the one who used to run to me after scraping his knee, the one who used to beam with pride when Henry would lift him high into the air. I never wanted to take credit for anything I said. I just wanted you to have a life better than mine. But somewhere along the way, I let myself become invisible. And now Laura thinks I'm disposable. He swallowed hard. "She shouldn't have said that. I should have defended you." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "It's not too late to do the right thing." He nodded slowly, but his eyes were clouded with worry. "Laura won't take this lying down. She's talking about selling the house and moving away. She thinks if we cut ties with you, everything will go back to normal." A sad smile touched my lips. "She can try. But the house isn't hers to sell. And running away won't erase the truth." After he left, I sat quietly processing our conversation. I didn't hate my son. I didn't even fully hate Laura. What I hated was what I had allowed them to become, people so entitled to my kindness that they saw it as weakness. That afternoon, I called Mr. Walters again. "I want to update my will," I told him. "My grandchildren will always be taken care of. But my son and Laura, I need them to understand that actions have consequences." He didn't sound surprised. "You've been quiet too long, Margaret. Sometimes the best lessons are the ones people never see coming." When I hung up, I felt a strange peace settle over me. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was simply taking back what had always been mine. Laura might think she could manipulate her way out of this, but the truth was a powerful thing. And when the truth was backed by legal documents, there wasn't much she could do. That night, I opened a box of old photos, Henry holding our son as a baby, our first modest house snapshots of Christmas mornings where the tree looked a little too bare, but our hearts were full. I realized something then. Henry and I had built a life out of nothing, and that was my legacy. Not the house, not the money, but the strength to endure and create. And I would be damned if I let anyone take that legacy from me. A week later, Laura finally made her move. She showed up at my door again, this time with a practiced smile and a tray of cookies. "Margaret," she said sweetly, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I just wanted to apologize for what I said." Her voice was warm, but her eyes were calculating. I knew this wasn't remorse. It was strategy. I stepped aside, letting her in. She placed the cookies on the counter and sat at my table like she owned the place. "I've been thinking," she began. "Maybe we could just move past this. Forget about who paid for what. Families shouldn't keep score, right?" I let her talk. She rambled on about how stressful life had been, how she had just been upset that day, how she didn't mean it the way it sounded. When she finally paused, I looked at her steadily. "Laura, I've given you years of my life, my money, my trust. I've asked for nothing in return, not even gratitude. But you crossed a line you can't erase with cookies and half-hearted apologies." Her smile faltered. "So what now? Are you really going to take everything from us?" I leaned forward slightly. "No, I'm going to give you a chance, one last chance, to treat me with the respect I deserve. But if you can't, I won't hesitate to act." "This isn't a threat, Laura. It's a promise." For once, she didn't have a comeback. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, her eyes darting away. I stood picking up the tray of cookies and placed it gently back in her hands. "I don't need this. What I need is for you to think very carefully about how you treat the person who gave you everything." As she left, her face was pale with a mix of anger and fear. That night, I wrote a letter not to Laura, but to my grandchildren. I told them stories about their grandfather, about the life we built, about the importance of kindness and gratitude. I wanted them to know who I was, not the version of me their mother painted. The next day, I mailed it. I wasn't trying to turn them against her. I just wanted them to know the truth before Laura twisted it to suit herself. Later that week, my son called again. "Mom, Laura's furious. She says you're trying to ruin her relationship with the kids." I sighed. "I'm trying to protect my relationship with them. I won't apologize for that." He was quiet for a long moment. "She wants to sell the house anyway. Says we can use the money to move somewhere new. Start fresh." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. "She can want whatever she likes. The house isn't hers to sell." There was silence on the line. Then softly he said, I think I made a mistake letting her control everything." It was the first real admission of guilt I had heard from him. And though it didn't erase the pain, it mattered. After we hung up, I realized that my fight wasn't just about the house. It was about reclaiming my place in my own family. I had been erased quietly, piece by piece, until even my son forgot where he came from. But now I was writing myself back in. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. The following morning, I woke up to an email from Mr. Walters confirming that all the paperwork had been finalized. The house was now legally, undeniably mine alone. My son and Laura couldn't touch it without my permission. Seeing it in writing gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. I stared at the email for a long while, thinking about how many years I'd spent quietly giving, never asking for recognition. I had been so afraid of looking selfish that I had let myself be erased. But now things were different. I decided it was time to stop waiting for Laura to change. People like her didn't change because of kind words. They changed when their actions finally had consequences. That afternoon, I drove to my bank and opened a new account separate from everything my son had access to. I transferred part of my savings and began setting aside money for my grandchildren's future. If Laura thought she could manipulate me out of guilt, she was sorely mistaken. My wealth would go exactly where I wanted it to go, not into the hands of someone who had mocked me to my face. That evening, my son came over. He stood in my doorway looking defeated. "Mom, I don't know what to do anymore," he admitted. "About what?" I asked calmly. "Laura," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "She won't stop talking about selling the house. She says you're trying to control us." "Control you?" I repeated, almost laughing. "I gave you everything without asking for anything back. The only thing I'm doing now is reminding you that generosity isn't infinite. Respect isn't optional." He dropped his gaze. "She doesn't see it that way." "Of course she doesn't," I said softly, "because you've let her believe that my silence was weakness. And now she's scared. People like her always are when the power they've abused is taken away." He didn't argue. He just sat at my table looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. "Son," I said gently, "I don't want to take your home. I don't want to hurt you. But if Laura can't find it in herself to respect me, then you need to decide where your loyalty lies." He nodded slowly, eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I know," he whispered. After he left, I sat alone in my living room thinking about Henry. I wondered what advice he would give me now. He had always been so clear about fairness. Never let someone mistake your kindness for weakness. Margaret. I realized then that this wasn't just about the house or Laura's insult. It was about every moment I'd allowed myself to fade into the background. Every time I'd swallowed my pride to keep the peace. Not anymore. The next morning, I called Mr. Walters again. "I want to take one more step," I told him. "I want to legally remove my son and Laura from any inheritance until I say otherwise. Everything will go to my grandchildren directly." There was a pause. Then he said, "You've made up your mind." "Yes," I replied firmly. "It's time they understand that actions have consequences." When I hung up, I felt lighter. It wasn't revenge. It was justice, the kind that came from finally standing in my own power. I looked around my quiet little house, sunlight spilling through the curtains. For the first time in years, it felt like my home again. And I knew deep down, this was only the beginning. 2 days later, Laura arrived unannounced again. This time, she didn't bother with fake smiles or cookies. She marched into my living room, arms crossed, her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous, Margaret," she snapped. "You've made your point. You're trying to embarrass us, and it's cruel. We're family. This isn't how families act." I stayed seated in my armchair, calm and collected. "Families don't tell each other to go live in a shelter," I replied. Laura flushed, her jaw tightening. I was upset. "I didn't mean it." "You did," I said softly. "You meant every word. You just didn't think I'd have the strength to stand up for myself." She scoffed. "So what now? You get to hold this over our heads forever. You'll just remind us every day that you own the house." I shook my head. "No, Laura, I don't need to remind you. You already know." She faltered, anger flashing in her eyes. "You're ruining our family." I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady. "No, I'm saving what's left of my dignity. And if that feels like I'm ruining your family, maybe you should ask yourself why." Laura's lips tightened, but she didn't respond. She grabbed her bag and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. When the silence settled again, I felt no regret, only relief. Later that evening, my son called. "Mom, she's furious. She says she can't live like this anymore." "You mean she can't live without power?" I corrected gently. There was a long pause. "You're right," he admitted. "I've let her dictate everything for too long. And I think I let her treat you this way because it was easier than standing up to her." Hearing him say it out loud broke my heart a little. I wanted to blame Laura for everything, but the truth was, my son had been complicit too. "I love you," I said quietly. "But love doesn't excuse silence. I needed you to defend me, and you didn't." "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry, Mom. Truly." For the first time, I believed he meant it. That night, I made a decision. I sat at my desk and wrote a letter, one my lawyer would hold on to. In it, I explained exactly why I was leaving my estate to my grandchildren and not to my son or Laura. It wasn't out of cruelty. It was out of fairness. I wanted them to understand that gratitude matters, that love without respect is meaningless. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. Laura had wanted me to fade away, to disappear quietly, but I wasn't going anywhere. And whether she liked it or not, she would never forget that. A week later, I decided it was time to take the final step. I asked Mr. Walters to arrange a formal meeting at his office. My son and Laura were both invited. The email made it clear that this was regarding important matters of property and inheritance, which ensured they wouldn't dare skip it. When I arrived, they were already seated. Laura's face was set in a stiff smile, her arms folded tightly. My son looked nervous, glancing between the two of us as if he were a child again, caught between parents in an argument. Mr. Walters greeted us warmly, then got straight to business. "Mrs. Ellison has finalized her property ownership. The house legally belongs to her alone, as it always has. She has also updated her will to ensure her estate is distributed according to her wishes." Laura shifted uncomfortably. "So what does that mean for us?" she asked, her voice sharp. "It means," Mr. Walters said calmly, "that while Margaret has graciously allowed you to continue living in the house, she retains all legal rights to it. She has also decided that her estate will pass directly to her grandchildren, bypassing both of you entirely. Laura's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her face flushed deep red as she turned to me. You can't be serious. I am, I replied quietly. I've spent my entire life giving to you, to my son, to this family. But giving without respect only breeds entitlement. This isn't revenge, Laura. It's accountability. My son looked down at his hands, shame written all over his face. Mom, I understand, he said softly. Laura turned on him, her eyes blazing. You're just going to let her do this? He looked at her, then at me. She's right, Laura. We've taken her for granted for too long. For the first time since Henry's death, I felt like someone finally understood me. Mr. Walters wrapped up the meeting, handing me copies of the finalized documents. Laura refused to meet my eyes as she stormed out. My son lingered for a moment. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. You can start by remembering who stood behind you when no one else did, I said gently. He nodded, his voice choked. I will, Mom. I promise. That evening as I drove home, the sun was setting in brilliant streaks of orange and gold. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't begged. I had simply told the truth and acted on it. And that, I realized, was the strongest thing I could have ever done. In the days following the meeting, the atmosphere shifted. Laura stopped coming to my house altogether, and for a brief moment I enjoyed the peace. My son visited alone once or twice, always looking like he had aged years in just days. Laura's furious, he told me one afternoon as we sat on my porch. She says you've humiliated her, that you've made her feel like a guest in her own home. I looked at him calmly. She feels like a guest because she never truly appreciated that she was one. He ran his hands through his hair, sighing heavily. I should have stopped this years ago. I let her control everything. I let her disrespect you. And I didn't do a damn thing to protect you. I studied him for a long moment. You can't change the past, son. But you can decide who you're going to be from now on. He nodded, his eyes glistening. I want to make it right, Mom. I don't know how yet, but I will. Hearing those words brought a bittersweet ache to my chest. For so long I'd missed the boy who used to love me without conditions. Maybe there was hope for him still. That evening I received a letter. An actual handwritten letter from my eldest granddaughter. Grandma, Mom says you're being mean, but I don't believe her. You've always been there for us. Thank you for everything. I love you. Tears welled in my eyes as I read her simple words. It reminded me why I had made these decisions, not out of anger, but out of love for the only ones who hadn't betrayed me. I sat at my desk and began writing letters to all my grandchildren. I told them about Henry, about how much we had sacrificed for family, about the importance of gratitude and respect. I wanted them to know the truth, that strength wasn't about who shouted the loudest, but who quietly endured without losing their integrity. Days turned into weeks. The tension between Laura and my son grew, their arguments echoing down the phone line whenever he called me. One evening, he showed up again, looking exhausted. Laura says she can't stay married to me if I keep siding with you, he confessed. I felt a pang of sadness. Son, this isn't about taking sides. It's about finally doing what's right. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw resolve in his eyes. I'm not going to lose you just to keep her happy anymore. For the first time in a long while, I reached out and hugged him. He clung to me like he had when he was a boy, and I realized that somewhere deep inside, he was still my son, the one who had always wanted to make me proud. Laura might have lost her battle for control, but I had regained something far more valuable: my voice, my dignity, and maybe even my son. It didn't take long for Laura to escalate things. One evening, my phone buzzed with a long text from her, a bitter tirade about how I had manipulated my son, turned him against her, and destroyed their marriage. I read it twice, then set my phone down without replying. There was no point in arguing with someone who couldn't see past her own pride. The next morning, my son came over. His face was pale, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. She left last night, he said quietly. Took the kids and went to her sister's. She said she's done with this marriage. I looked at him for a long moment. Are you okay? He shrugged, his voice breaking. I don't know. Maybe this is for the best. I should have stood up for you and for myself years ago. I've been living in fear of upsetting her for too long." Hearing him admit that hurt and comforted me at the same time. "Son," I said gently, "sometimes losing what you thought you needed is the only way to find out who you really are." He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm scared, Mom. I don't know what happens next." "You start over," I said simply, "and you teach your children what respect and gratitude look like. That's how you make this right." That afternoon, I baked cookies. Real cookies, not the fake peace offering Laura had once brought me. My grandchildren came over, their laughter filling my kitchen. For a few hours, everything felt normal again. "Grandma, why don't you live with us?" my youngest granddaughter asked innocently. I smiled softly, because Grandma finally decided to live for herself. That night, after the house grew quiet again, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. I wrote about everything: the sacrifices I'd made, the pain I'd endured, and the strength it took to finally stand up for myself. I realized that for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. Laura had tried to erase me, but instead she had reminded me of who I really was. And that was something no one could ever take away again. Weeks passed and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. My son visited often, sometimes with the children, sometimes alone. He seemed lighter without Laura's constant presence looming over him. There was a sadness in his eyes, yes, but also a strange sense of relief, like a man finally free to breathe. One afternoon, as we sat on my porch drinking coffee, he said quietly, "Mom, I didn't realize how much of my life I lived just trying to keep her happy. I let her make me believe you were a burden, that you were holding us back. And now I can see how wrong I was." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You can't change the past, son, but you can teach your children to do better." He nodded. "That's exactly what I want to do." Over the following weeks, I worked with Mr. Walters to finalize the trust fund for my grandchildren. Every detail was carefully laid out: college funds, financial safeguards, even letters they would receive when they turned 18, explaining why their grandmother had made these choices. It wasn't about punishing my son. It was about breaking the cycle of entitlement before it reached another generation. One evening, as I tucked away the final set of documents, I realized how much lighter I felt. For years, I had been carrying the weight of my silence, believing that being a good mother meant giving endlessly without asking for respect. But I understood now that love without boundaries isn't love, it's self-erasure. A few days later, Laura called. Her voice was icy but controlled. "I want to talk about the kids," she said. "We can talk," I replied evenly, "but only if it's about the children. I'm done discussing anything else." She was quiet for a moment, then muttered, "You're not the same woman you used to be." "You're right," I said. I finally remembered who I am. When I hung up, I felt no anger, no sadness, just peace. That night, I sat on my porch watching the sunset. The sky was streaked with deep oranges and purples, and I thought of Henry. I imagined him sitting next to me, smiling proudly, telling me I'd finally done what he always knew: I could stand my ground with grace. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a supporting character in my own life. I was the author again, and my story was far from over. Spring arrived slowly, bringing with it warmer days and the sound of birds returning to the trees outside my window. Life felt different now, lighter, freer. I spent more time with my grandchildren, taking them to the park, baking with them, and telling them stories about their grandfather. They asked questions about him, constantly curious about the man they had never truly known. One afternoon, as we sat on a picnic blanket under a blooming cherry tree, my eldest granddaughter asked Grandma, "Why don't you live with us? You'd never be lonely." I smiled and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Because Grandma has her own home, and sometimes it's important to have a space that's just yours." She nodded thoughtfully, far too wise for her age. In the weeks that followed, I noticed my son changing. He seemed more present, more involved with the children. Without Laura dictating everything, he began to rebuild his relationship with them and with me. One evening, as we washed dishes together after dinner, he looked at me and said softly, "I don't deserve how forgiving you've been." I placed a hand on his arm. "I don't forgive easily, son, but I love you. That's why I chose to give you a second chance." His eyes filled with tears. I'll never let anyone treat you like that again. I promise. Those words meant more than any apology ever could. Meanwhile, Laura tried to hold on to what control she could. There were messages, calls, attempts to make me look like the villain to her friends and family. But the power she once had was gone. The truth was out, and there was no going back. One day she showed up again this time, not angry, not fake sweet, but desperate. Margaret, she said quietly, I made a mistake. I know I hurt you, but I don't want to lose everything. I looked at her for a long moment. Laura, I don't hate you. I never have. But respect isn't optional. It's earned, and I can't trust that you won't hurt me again. Her eyes filled with tears. Please, can we just start over? I shook my head gently. Starting over isn't as simple as pretending the past didn't happen. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. She looked at me for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, shoulders hunched in defeat. That night, as I sat alone in my living room, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't sought revenge. I had simply stood my ground and reminded them who I was. Henry had always told me one day, Margaret, you'll see that strength doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be steady. Now I understood exactly what he meant. I glanced around my home, and felt a surge of quiet pride. For years I had given away pieces of myself believing that love meant sacrifice without limits. But finally I had reclaimed what was mine. And the best part, I knew my grandchildren would grow up remembering me not as a silent shadow in the corner, but as someone who loved, fiercely gave selflessly, and knew when to stand tall. Summer crept in with long golden evenings and the sound of crickets humming in the warm air. My life had settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in years, peaceful, deliberate, and free of the tension that had once clung to me like a shadow. The grandchildren visited often. We spent afternoons baking pies, evenings playing board games, and lazy mornings talking about their dreams for the future. I told them stories about Henry, how we had started with nothing, how every brick in this family's life had been laid with love and sacrifice. One day, my eldest grandson asked, Grandma, do you ever feel sad that you don't live with us? I smiled softly. No, sweetheart, because I have a home that's mine and I'm proud of it. It's not about where you live. It's about knowing your worth and never letting anyone take it away. Those words stayed with me long after he ran outside to play. They reminded me how far I had come from a woman who had quietly given everything to one who had finally learned to take back her power. My son came by more often now, always looking a little more at peace each time. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the fireflies flicker in the dark, he said, Mom, I never realized how much you sacrificed for me. I thought being a good son was just providing for my family. But I forgot who provided for me first. Tears stung my eyes, but I smiled. You didn't forget, son. You just needed reminding. Laura didn't come around anymore. We heard from her occasionally, mostly about arrangements for the children, but she no longer had the power she once wielded. Her control was gone, and with it, the hold she had over my son. In the months that followed, my lawyer finalized the trust for my grandchildren. I wrote personal letters for each of them, letters they would receive when they turned 18. In those letters, I told them about the importance of gratitude, respect, and never letting anyone diminish their worth. When everything was in order, I finally felt free. One warm evening, as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I whispered Henry's name softly. We did it, I said. I found my strength again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a silent observer in my own life. I was the author of my story, and I had chosen dignity over bitterness, truth over silence. To anyone else, it might have looked like a quiet victory. But for me, it was everything. I had given freely, endured silently, and finally claimed my power without needing to raise my voice. And in that silence, I found myself again. For those who watch my story, remember this. Kindness is not weakness. Boundaries are not cruelty. You are allowed to reclaim what is yours, even if it shocks the people who have always underestimated you. If my story makes you think about your own life, I want to hear from you. Tell me, have you ever stayed silent for too long? And what happened when you finally spoke up? Because maybe you'll find that quiet strength is the loudest power of all.